Hello, this is Todd Luck, and they say never judge a book by its cover because oftentimes covers are not representative of what's inside of a book. And so, for instance, let's take this fantastic Frank Frazetta cover. Looks amazing, but these are supposed to be red Martians with red skin. Instead, we have characters with very pale, pasty white skin. And this is not Frazetta's fault, right? He was just following in a very long tradition of cover artists who did the exact same thing. But what happens when a cover is so wildly inaccurate, it has almost nothing to do with the source material, but is so popular it takes a life of its own? Well, of course, you make a comic book of it. This is a review of Frank Frazetta's Moon Maid one-shot by Image Comics. And so The Moon Maid is a novel by Edgar Rice Burroughs, who was the creator of Tarzan and John Carter. And so this is Frank Frazetta's painting based on that novel. And it follows, again, in a very long tradition of inaccurate cover paintings. Most infamously, this alien that the princess is riding is not supposed to be a centaur. And so we're going to take a look at this comic. It was published in 2009 and is not based on the novel, but based on Frazetta's painting, and actually tells a story to kind of justify all of this stuff on the cover. So we're going to be doing a review of that. And then at the end, just for fun, we're going to be taking a look at that tradition of inaccurate covers that Frank Frazetta was following and what the actual characters in the novel really look like. But first, a quick note for Frazetta collectors who will probably know that this is not the first painting that Frazetta did of the Moon Maid. This is actually the second version of it. And so this is a way to get this cover on a comic book. However, there has not been a way to get the first Moon Maid painting on a comic book cover up until now. But that is about to change because right now there is a Kickstarter for a graphic novel collecting the latest Moon Maid comics, and it's called Moon Maid The Three Keys. And as a higher tier, there is going to be a Frank Frazetta variant cover with the first painting of the Moon Maid. And this is going to be your only chance to get it on a comic book cover. It's going to be a Kickstarter exclusive. It's going on right now. If you see this video within the first, like, say 13 days of me posting it, then you still have time to get in on it. And it's kind of pricey, but if you're a Frank Frazetta collector, it might be worth it to you. And so let's take a look at this cover, which I think is really one of the main attractions for this issue. And so you'll notice there's a border around it, and that may seem counterintuitive because it does make the painting smaller. But if you think about it, if they did it full bleed, right, if it covered the entire space of the cover, then this would be at the top and we would have the Moon Maid logo covering part of Frazetta's work here, and they didn't want to do that. And so that's a pretty understandable compromise to put the border around. And the cool thing is the black does wrap all the way around and looks very sleek. And I think the painting reproduces well. It is a darker work. It's coming off a little bit lighter on screen than it is in person. But the contrast of light and dark obviously makes the Moon Maid there pop out. And the centaur has enough highlights on him to make him definable and look really cool. And we also get background. We can see craters over here. We can see a mountain in the background. And I'm not quite sure what that is. Is that an opening in the moon's crust so we can see the sun? Is this another planet and another moon? I'm not sure. We do have some flying creatures up here. They'll become important later. And the only thing not really touched on in the story is what's going on with the Moon Maid's cape. It is kind of deteriorating into this mist. It's kind of like smoke coming off her back. It's not explained in the comic and has nothing to do with the novel, but it does look cool. And by the way, the original painting for this is actually owned by movie director Robert Rodriguez. And so he actually is a huge Frazetta fan, has a big Frazetta collection, and he is actually looking to do a remake of Fire and Ice. And we're greeted to a detail of the painting on the inside cover, along with our variants at the bottom. And so the comic opens with our Moon Maid on the run, and Maid is just an old-timey way of saying woman. It's short for maiden. And so, no, she doesn't do dishes or windows. And so she's wearing a little bit more clothing than on the cover. and we established that this is a dead moon of an alien world. And she's running from these giant ape creatures for some reason. And then this demonic looking centaur guy comes in and fights the ape. Taking a page out of The Wizard of Oz, those flying creatures on the cover turn out to be flying monkeys. The artwork is pretty solid. I mean, it could use a little bit more refinement for the storytelling and the female anatomy, but the backgrounds are gorgeous. The male anatomy and the centaur look great. And I do like his faces. I mean, I think Moon Maid has a really great looking face there. Also, props on the coloring, because the centaur and oftentimes parts of the background are colored dark, but it always complements the pencils instead of covering it up. It looks great. And the story, you're not buying this for the story. It really reminds me of Image comics back in like the 90s, those style of comics from Image or Ominous or something like that. The story is a very simple setup, right? She is running from those ape creatures. The centaur comes in, kills the ape creatures. And then we start trying to give the reader a backstory by just bombarding them with a whole bunch of alien names and places and stuff just in the dialogue, right? There's no illustration of it to show us who is what and all of this stuff. And it's a little bit hard to keep up with, especially when we throw in a twist in the middle about what the heck's going on here. And the twist is unfortunately so absurd and silly that I just had a hard time wrapping my brain around it in the middle of all of this, fantasy gobbledygook with all the different, names of the gods and the people and the places and all that. I did understand by the ending, by the final battle, I did know what was going on. But like I said, you're not buying this for the story. So the main draws to this are, of course, the cover, and then just the weirdness of this comic even existing, right? That this is a Moon Maid comic, not based on the novel, but based on the inaccurate cover painting. Just such a weird, unique comic. And so I didn't know this, but apparently at the time there was a whole line of Frank Frazetta comics, including this one shot called Freedom, a comic called Neanderthal, the Fantastic Worlds of Frazetta trade paperbacks, a Death Dealer miniseries. There's also an advertisement in the back for a miniseries for Silver Warrior, but unfortunately I cannot find any evidence that this actually came out, which is a shame because this would make a really, really cool looking comic cover. And so this one shot doesn't impress me as much as the modern Frazetta comics that are coming out right now from Opus and Fire and Ice that's coming out from Dynamite. But that doesn't necessarily reflect on the other comics that Image did of Frazetta stuff, so you might want to check those out as well. All right, so let's talk about the artistic tradition that did give us this cover. And so, as I said, this guy, he's not a centaur, but he's been portrayed that way on Moon Maid covers since 1926. That was when the Moon Maid was originally published as a book, and that cover was by the famous artist Alan St. John. And so as I show you that original piece, I am going to read Edgar Rice Burroughs' reaction to it. This is going to be from a letter that Edgar Rice Burroughs sent to a higher up at the publishing company. You know how to handle St. John better than I do, and I certainly had no expectations of finding anything to criticize in his technique or his handling of the illustrations. But you might tell him about my suggestion, which was made purely from a desire to check up on very natural errors which might be made by St. John or anyone else, a concrete example of which hangs on my wall before me in an original illustrations for the Moon Maid, in which he shows one of my moon creatures, I have forgotten what they are called, with 6 limbs instead of 4, an error which I could have caught if merely a rough sketch of the illustration had been sent me. Probably this has had no effect upon the sale of the book, yet I am sure that St. John would be fully as anxious as I am to have his illustrations conform to the text, which he has apparently always sought to do. And so that creature is actually called a Vagas, and it has been illustrated as a centaur in many book covers after that original one throughout the years. And that tradition goes all the way to 1995 when Joe Jusko would include this illustration in his Edgar Rice Burroughs card sets. And so what should this stuff look like? So let's start with the Moon Maid herself. That would be Princess Nyla. And so in the novel, Nyla is described as wearing a gossamer tunic, and it goes down to her knees and has an opening where you can see her thighs sometime. The flying creatures we saw are actually the Yuga, which is a pale human race that lives inside of the moon, and they fly around on artificial wings. And by the way, of course, this is before Gardner Fox created Hawkman. The novel does not take place on the surface of the moon, but inside of it in a world called Vana. And this is a lush tropical world that lines the inside of the moon. And yes, Burroughs wrote a jungle adventure inside of the moon. Got to remember, this is the same guy who created Tarzan. And the creature on the cover is the Vagas. And so Vagas are these horse-like creatures with human faces. And so they can walk around on all fours and carry things on their back, similar to the cart titan on Attack on Titan, but they can also stand upright and throw spears and all that good stuff. And this is Edgar Rice Burroughs' illustration of what they look like. So artists trying to keep to the novel's descriptions have had many different artistic interpretations of the Vagas. This is Tarzan versus the Moon Men from the 1990s. I recently did a review of this, and this is a symbolic cover. They're not really giants, but you do get a sense of what they might look like. Here's an example of them on all fours, which is how they usually get around. In recent years, EdgarRiceBurroughs.com has been putting out an online comic strip adapting the Moon Maid. The strip is called Moon Men, and in there, the Vagas wear a lot less clothes, and they're definitely a little bit closer to human looking. And in recent years, Moon Maid comics like Moon Maid to Three Keys have used similar artistic interpretation. And this modern interpretation of them actually makes them quite attractive, which is kind of interesting. They still have that wider face than normal humans have that Burroughs described. Female Vagas are described as having a more narrow face, which is more human-like. And in the novel, they're described as having udders with 4 to 6 teats, but in this artistic interpretation, those udders look just like female breasts on a human. The Vagas are a savage race that live in tribes, and they can only eat 2 things on the entire planet. Animals are poisonous to them, so they can only consume the humans or the Yugos who live inside of the moon and each other. And so they're constantly attacking other tribes and eating their fallen enemies. But the Vagas are not the main villains of the Moon Maid novel. That is actually the Kalkar, who conquered the inside of the moon and then in later novels invade the Earth, conquering it and plunging it into a new dark age without modern technology, where humans fight for centuries to overthrow them and reclaim the Earth. And also, just for fun, here is an attempt by the great William Stout to do a version of the Moon Maid cover with a more novel-accurate Vagas, which I think looks pretty cool. If you're interested in Moon Men or Moon Maid comics, then Tarzan versus the Moon Men ran in Tarzan 17 through 20 in the 1990s, and the American Mythology Moon Maid comics are available at AmericanMythology.net and on the Comixology. And if you want to check out the novels, Edgar Rice Burroughs' Moon Trilogy has had plenty of printings, and there's plenty of different ways to read it. It's The Moon Maid, The Moon Men, and The Red Hawk. All right, that's it. Like and subscribe for more videos. And until next time, see ya.